Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Some subjects become dangerous, not when they are spoken of, but when they are merely heard. The very act of acknowledging certain ruins, half-buried, ill-documented, and absent from official maps, may place us within their influence. Tonight, we examine such a subject, the forgotten temples of the great old ones, and what they may have been built to conceal. These are not temples in any familiar sense. They bear no inscriptions of worship, no clear signs of ritual, no evidence of congregation. Their angles resist survey. Their origins predate all known civilizations, sometimes even the presence of human life. And yet they recur across Lovecraft's fragmented narratives and in the uneasily consistent reports of fictional scholars, sailors, and madmen. Architecture becomes the vehicle by which terror bypasses symbolism altogether. This investigation is not an attempt to uncover a single meaning. Rather, we will trace a series of unsettling correspondences between forgotten architecture and epistemological collapse, between sacred ruins and cosmic disinterest, between literary fiction and the structures it dares to describe. Our approach moves deliberately, from historical influences to philosophical implications, from literary invention to cultural residue. By proceeding, you are not simply learning about these structures. You are taking the first step into their conceptual framework. Once entered, it rarely allows full departure. The early 20th century was an age of excavation, both literal and psychological. Western archaeologists were unearthing ancient cities beneath layers of desert sand and jungle moss, proclaiming long-lost civilizations newly found. The public imagination followed closely, captivated by tales of sunken temples and forgotten kings. At the same time, a darker undercurrent ran beneath this cultural enthusiasm. The Taos, realization that some discoveries refused to cohere with established history. Structures without names, monuments without inscriptions, temples that seemed too old, too large, too alien. It is within this climate that H.P. Lovecraft began to write of ruins not just lost, but never meant to be found. Lovecraft's fiction emerged during the golden age of imperial archaeology. Between 1890 and 1930, expeditions funded by museums and colonial powers uncovered the ruins of Ur, Knossos, Teotihuacan, and Mohenjo-Daro. These sites enthralled the public precisely because they stretched history backwards. Lovecraft, ever attuned to the limits of human knowledge, inverted this appeal. His temples extended time not by centuries, but by unthinkable epochs, predating even the human species. Consider his consistent use of terms like pre-human, antediluvian, or megalithic. These were not flourishes. They were warnings. For Lovecraft, architecture was not a relic of civilization, but a rupture in the illusion of human centrality. The ruins described in the Call of Cthulhu, or At the Mountains of Madness, do not belong to known cultures, nor are they attributed to mythical human predecessors. Rather, they are tied to entities whose biology, purpose, and temporal scale remain unresolved. This is crucial. Lovecraft refrains from populating these temples with coherent religious systems. Instead, he emphasizes their functionality without familiarity. One might say they are sacred only in the sense that they are unapproachable. What we label temple may, within the fiction, be containment unit, dimensional anchor, or architectural symptom of cosmic events. The word temple becomes an act of projection, a human label desperately imposed on a structure that actively resists meaning. We must pause here to consider what Lovecraft leaves unsaid. He does not describe these temples in detail because he cannot. To do so would reduce their alienness. Instead, he implies their presence through the psychological effects they have on observers: vertigo, hallucination, and obsessive thought. In this way, architecture becomes narrative method. The temple is not just a setting, but a vector of madness. This reveals something profound, that horror may not lie in what the structure contains, but in what its mere existence implies. That there was once intelligence capable of shaping matter on scales we do not understand, following purposes we cannot guess, and then vanishing completely. That idea alone destabilizes any chronology in which human culture is the pinnacle of development. Lovecraft's creator intent, as expressed in his letters, supports this interpretation. In correspondence with Clark Ashton Smith and others, he repeatedly voiced disdain for the anthropocentrism of traditional horror. Ghost stories were parochial, haunted houses, too local. True cosmic horror, he argued, had to unsettle the foundations of perception. His ruins are, therefore, not atmospheric props, but ideological weapons. They erode the stability of the world itself. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, he wrote, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. The temple, in Lovecraft's hands, becomes the embodiment of the unknowable, made physical. We see echoes of this architectural unease across multiple stories. The sunken city of R'lyeh rises amidst scenes which cannot be described, not because Lovecraft is avoiding imagery, but because he is gesturing toward a form that violates linguistic containment. Similarly, the Antarctic ruins in At the Mountains of Madness unfold through a process of partial recognition. Murals that depict a history humans can half understand. Corridors whose scale suggests non-human movement. Angles that produce nausea rather than orientation. These are not anomalies within a known framework. They are exposures of an entirely different order of being. They ask a question Lovecraft never answers. What kind of mind builds a temple no human can enter without consequence? This brings us to a crucial distinction. These are not ruins in the traditional sense. They are not the remains of a known past. They are interruptions in the timeline, evidence of something that should not be possible. In this way, they resemble black holes in historical consciousness, locations that attract speculation but resist illumination. Lovecraft understood this intuitively. He never allows his narrators full access. There is always a barrier, linguistic, psychological, or physical. And in this deliberate withholding, we glimpse his intent, not to describe the alien, but to force us to imagine the limits of our own comprehension. In the next section, we turn from Lovecraft's cultural moment to the deeper precedents that shaped his temple motifs. For while these structures may seem unprecedented, they echo certain ancient forms, megaliths, ziggurats, and sacred enclosures that likewise obscured their true purpose behind the veil of monumental silence. Long before Lovecraft, human cultures constructed sacred spaces that exceeded practical explanation. Megalithic sites such as Göbekli Tepe, dated to approximately 9600 BCE, predate agriculture and permanent settlement, yet exhibit deliberate architectural planning. This historical fact unsettles linear narratives of progress. How could ritual architecture precede stable society? Such questions lingered unresolved well into the early 20th century, circulating in academic and popular discourse alike. Lovecraft absorbed these tensions indirectly. His temples inherit the anxiety provoked by structures that appear too early in history, suggesting that civilization may follow forces it does not initiate. Consider the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, particularly those of Ur and Eridu, excavated intensively between 1850 and 1920. These step towers were not simply places of worship. They functioned as symbolic interfaces between earth and sky, human and divine. Yet even ancient sources disagreed on their purpose. Were they dwellings for gods, observation platforms, or ritual centers? This ambiguity matters. Lovecraft's temples operate in a similar register. They are not houses of gods, but sites of contact, structures whose meaning emerges only through proximity, and often at great psychological cost. We must pause here to consider the anthropological problem of sacred architecture without narrative. Many early religious sites lack explanatory texts. Stonehenge, for example, offers alignment without doctrine. Easter Island presents monumental labor without surviving theology. These sites resist interpretation because they sever function from explanation. Lovecraft exploits this disjunction. His temples are not mysterious because they hide secrets, but because they were never designed to communicate with humans at all. Not places of devotion, but residues of processes indifferent to human understanding. Philosophically, this aligns with late 19th century pessimism and early 20th century cosmic skepticism. Thinkers such as Arthur Schopenhauer and later Friedrich Nietzsche dismantled teleological comfort. The universe, they argued, does not progress toward meaning. Lovecraft radicalizes this position through architecture. His temples do not symbolize cosmic order. They expose cosmic absence. They stand as evidence that intelligence can exist without morality, purpose without narrative, construction without symbolism. This reveals something profound. Meaning may be a local phenomenon, not a universal one. Comparisons to mythological traditions sharpen this insight. In Greek myth, temples reflected the gods' personalities. In Hindu cosmology, temples encoded metaphysical diagrams. Even in Norse traditions, sacred halls reinforced social values. Lovecraft's temples do none of this. They lack iconography, mythology, and ritual continuity. They are not sacred, because they are revered, but because they are untouchable. The sacred shifts from moral center to cognitive limit. What happens when the holy is defined not by reverence, but by incomprehensibility? Anthropology also offers a relevant parallel in taboo spaces. Certain Polynesian Marae and Mesoamerican enclosures were restricted not to protect worshippers, but to contain dangerous power. Entry was limited, knowledge restricted, violations punished. Lovecraft's temples echo this logic while removing its cultural scaffolding. There are no priests, no initiates, no sanctioned interpretations, only accidental witnesses, only aftermaths. The triad recurs across his fiction: discovery, exposure, collapse. Each temple completes this sequence with mechanical inevitability. By situating his ruins within these deep cultural patterns, megalithic construction, sacred ambiguity, philosophical pessimism, Lovecraft anchors his cosmic horror in recognizable intellectual soil. Yet he strips that soil of reassurance. These temples do not connect humanity to the cosmos. They estrange humanity from it. In the next subsection, we examine how language itself strains under this burden, and how the very word temple begins to fracture under the weight of what it is asked to describe. To call something a temple is to assume purpose. The term originates from the Latin templum, referring not to a structure, but to a delimited space set apart for observation, often of the sky. Over time, the word accrued layers of function as a place of worship, ritual, containment, and sanctity. In Lovecraft's fiction, however, this linguistic inheritance becomes destabilized. The label temple is applied by narrators reaching for intelligibility, not by any reliable knowledge of the structures themselves. The term masks confusion with a veneer of categorization. What if the structure in question was never meant to be understood as a temple at all? Lovecraft's characters rarely encounter temples by name. Instead, they report ruins, cyclopean masonry, sunken stone, or massive archways. Only in hindsight, often filtered through recovered documents or hearsay, do these forms become identified as sacred. The shift is revealing. It is the reader or scholar who names these things temples, and thus imports a framework of sacredness onto structures that may be hostile to the very concept. The designation is not descriptive, but diagnostic. It reveals more about human interpretive desperation than about the ruins themselves. Certain descriptive terms recur with uncanny frequency in Lovecraft's architecture. Non-Euclidean, monolithic, impossible angles, strange geometries. These are not metaphorical flourishes. They signal a direct failure of linguistic adequacy. Euclidean geometry, our default spatial grammar, depends on parallel lines, right angles, and planar surfaces. To say that a temple in Arlaye violates these rules is to say that it is constructed in a logic foreign to human perception. The term non-Euclidean becomes a placeholder for terror that cannot be translated into spatial familiarity. What happens when space itself becomes alien? We must consider the symbolic implications of geometry that resists orientation. In many religious traditions, sacred geometry undergirds temple design. Gothic cathedrals mirror divine proportions. Islamic architecture encodes cosmic symmetry. In contrast, Lovecraft's temples express anti-symbolism. Their forms neither mimic nor reference any known metaphysical order. This inversion is not just aesthetic, it is philosophical. These structures do not represent higher truths. They undermine the very idea of representation. They are not symbols, they are intrusions. Consider the triadic language used in the Call of Cthulhu: loathsome, non-Euclidean, nightmare. These are not analytical descriptors, but effective reactions. The temple induces language to fail. Its angles induce nausea. Its scale defies documentation. Narrators resort to metaphor, not to clarify, but to signal the limits of description. The result is a rhetorical paradox. The more they describe, the more they reveal their inability to describe. This tension becomes part of the horror itself. One may ask, if these structures are so alien, why call them temples at all? The answer lies in a literary device Lovecraft mastered: deliberate misnaming. By calling a ruin a temple, the text invites interpretation while simultaneously withholding justification. The reader is drawn in by a word with deep cultural weight, only to find that none of its expected features apply. There is no altar, no deity, no congregation, only stone and scale and silence. This rhetorical bait and switch transforms language into a trap. It reveals something profound, that the very tools we use to make meaning can become vectors of disorientation. There are scattered references to carvings and symbols in some of Lovecraft's temples, particularly in At the Mountains of Madness and The Nameless City. But these are not readable texts. They are semiotic dead ends. Symbols spiral into abstraction. Languages decay into untranslatability. In the Dunwich horror, occult glyphs mark the terrain but yield no interpretive key. This is not oversight, it is method. Language exists at the boundary of knowledge. When structures come from beyond that boundary, they degrade linguistic stability itself. As we proceed, we must ask, what is the narrative function of this symbolic collapse? These temples are not just hard to describe, they resist being known. Etymology and language fail precisely because they were not evolved to process this kind of stimulus. In Lovecraft's universe, the sacred is not reverent, it is corrosive. The next section will trace how this corrosion spreads into narrative itself, through partial accounts, missing documentation, and deliberately unreliable records. The problem is no longer what these temples are. The problem is how we ever thought we could know. Lovecraft did not write mythologies in the traditional sense. He constructed narrative systems designed to appear mythological, fragments, apocrypha, and second-hand testimonies assembled to simulate the residue of a deeper, older structure. His temples occupy this space of narrative simulation. They are not described in full, nor situated with cartographic certainty. Rather, they are evoked through partial accounts, contradictory sources, and textual absences. This technique, often mistaken for vagueness, is in fact a calculated method of myth building, authenticity achieved through incompleteness. Consider the recurring narrative framing device of the found document. In At the Mountains of Madness, we receive a first-hand expedition account, but only after the event, and only to dissuade others from repeating the journey. In The Call of Cthulhu, we piece together the submerged city of R'lyeh through journals, interviews, and translations, none of them authoritative on their own. The temple is never directly encountered in real time by the reader. Instead, it hovers at the edge of reportable experience. Its reality accrues through accumulation of flawed testimony rather than single-point depiction. This technique mimics the structure of real-world mythology. Foundational myths rarely appear as singular origin stories. They emerge from layered retellings, regional variants, and contradictory narratives. Lovecraft's temples follow this pattern precisely. One narrator describes a ruin in the Arabian desert. Another speaks of strange stone formations in the South Pacific. The reader begins to sense a shared architecture underneath these accounts, not the repetition of a known form, but the recurrence of an impossible one. The very inconsistency of details becomes part of the system. As with oral myth, dissonance signals depth. We must pause here to examine a key insight. Lovecraft does not aim for belief, but for the illusion of discoverability. His narrative simulates scholarly process, translation, annotation, analysis, without ever granting closure. The ruins are treated as if they could be studied, yet each attempt at study falters. This reveals something profound. The temple becomes a site of epistemic performance. Its role is not to reveal truth, but to expose the futility of reaching it. The more the characters uncover, the more fragmented the picture becomes. This fragmentation is not accidental. It mirrors the psychological effects of the temples themselves. In Lovecraft's stories, those who come close to these structures often experience mental deterioration, paranoia, obsession, hallucinations. The narrative follows suit. Documentation becomes unreliable. Accounts diverge. The written word, once presumed stable, begins to fray. In this sense, the myth building around the temples enacts the very cognitive breakdown that the temples are said to induce. The reader participates in the same disorientation as the characters, simply by engaging with the layered texts. Authenticity is further enhanced through Lovecraft's appropriation of scholarly forms. He embeds footnotes, invented citations, and textual commentary throughout his stories. The infamous Necronomicon, while fictional, is always situated within a web of other texts, translations, commentaries, censorship. The temples are treated similarly. They are referenced in explorers' notes, mentioned in passing by occult scholars, hinted at in suppressed maps. This technique, layering fictional artifacts with the tone of real scholarship, blurs the boundary between myth and historiography. The temple becomes less a location and more a trace, something that once was, or perhaps still is, just out of view. Rhetorically, this creates a peculiar effect. The reader is not shown the temple, but is made to feel its absence. The narrative draws a silhouette around the structure, constructing negative space that the imagination fills. The technique is effective because it mirrors real historical mystery. Consider ancient sites like the Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni or the Osirian at Abydos, locations with unclear purpose, suggestive acoustics, and architectural anomalies. Lovecraft's temples exist in the same conceptual register. They feel authentic, not because of their detail, but because of their resistance to detail. In sum, Lovecraft achieves narrative authenticity through a system of intentional gaps. His myth-building does not culminate in revelation, but in suspended understanding. These temples are not hidden in the traditional sense. They are withheld by unreliable narrators, fragmentary records, and narrative structure itself. And this withholding is the point. In the next section, we leave the architecture behind, temporarily to examine the ideas these temples encode, not as symbols, but as philosophical disruptions in the fabric of human knowing. Lovecraft's temples do not exist to explain. They exist to erode. Their forms, vast, alien, and architecturally inexplicable, operate not as symbols of power, but as refutations of human centrality. In the classical world, temples were monuments to human divine alignment, embodiments of celestial order scaled for terrestrial perception. Lovecraft inverts this tradition. His temples are not reflections of cosmic harmony, but manifestations of cosmic indifference. They do not communicate with the human psyche. They overwrite it. The first and most persistent concept these temples encode is insignificance. Not moral, but ontological. And at the Mountains of Madness, the protagonist surveys a sprawling alien city, temples included, realizing it was built by the elder things long before humans emerged. The realization comes with a grim footnote. The effect was that of a cyclopean maze of dark, moist stone, which began to impress itself upon me as having a distinctly non-human character. This impression deepens into horror as the explorer recognizes that human life is not the climax of evolutionary history, but a biological afterthought. The temples are not ruins of our world, they are intact features of another. This architectural permanence underscores the second concept, entropy. In Lovecraft's cosmology, disorder is not a descent from order. It is the natural baseline. His temples do not crumble due to time. They persist despite it. Their alien materials resist decay, not in triumph, but as an affront to human temporality. What humanity considers ruin, the cosmos treats as structure. Time does not dissolve these temples. Instead, it reveals them through melting ice, shifting tides, or momentary alignments. Their emergence is not a rebirth, but a resurfacing. Consider this carefully. In Lovecraft, entropy is not destruction, but exposure. This leads to the most conceptually destabilizing theme, dream reality. Many of Lovecraft's temples, especially in stories like The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, exist in spaces where the distinction between physical and mental terrain collapses. The city of Keliphias, the plateau of Leng, and the temples of the Dreamlands follow an inverted logic. constructed from collective imagination or ancient memory, but still real, still hazardous. The idea that thought and matter might share ontological status destabilizes empirical reality. If temples can exist in dreams and leave physical residue, what boundary remains? A telling example occurs in The Nameless City, where the narrator descends into a ruin that should not have been there. He experiences intense hallucinations, hears whispers, and feels a shift in spatial logic. He later writes, "I knew that I was close to a terrible truth, or possibly an ancient dream." The ambiguity is deliberate. Lovecraft consistently resists clarifying whether the temples are spatial, anomalies, or psychological ones. This rhetorical instability becomes thematic. The temple is not a place, it is a state into which the world briefly falls. We must pause here. These three concepts, insignificance, entropy, dream reality, are not independent. They coalesce into a fourth, implicit one, the unreliability of all human structuring systems. Language, science, time, and logic all begin to falter in proximity to these temples. The narrator does not go mad from what he sees. He loses sanity because the tools by which he organizes reality stop working. This reveals something profound, that madness is not a deviation from reason, but the condition that emerges when reason meets something larger than itself. Philosophically, this aligns Lovecraft with cosmic pessimists like Thomas Ligotti and Peter Wessel Zapffe, who argue that consciousness is a maladaptive trait, a flaw that forces humans to perceive horror without resolution. The temples stand as monuments to this flaw. They neither attack nor seduce. They simply exist, and in doing so, reveal the fragility of human mental architecture, not by inflicting pain, but by exposing its irrelevance. The temple is the absence of recognition. In sum, Lovecraft's temples express a cluster of philosophical horrors. They imply a universe not hostile to humanity, but fundamentally unaccommodating. Their geometry defies spatial norms, their longevity disrupts time, their appearance in dreams challenges reality itself. We emerge from them not merely afraid, but altered. In the next section, we will examine the beings, if any, associated with these temples. For in Lovecraft's universe, even the term inhabitant becomes unstable. Who or what were these places built to interface with? And are they still watching? Lovecraft's temples imply builders, yet resist inhabitants. This distinction is critical. In conventional myth, temples house gods. In Lovecraft's cosmology, the association is far more tenuous. The great old ones are linked to these structures, but rarely as residents. They are forces whose presence once necessitated architecture, not beings who currently occupy it. The temple marks a point of intersection between dimensions, epochs, or states of matter, rather than a dwelling. To assume residency is to misapply human spatial logic to entities that do not meaningfully exist within space at all. Cthulhu provides the most familiar example. In the Call of Cthulhu, R'lyeh is described as a great stone city, its geometry hostile to human perception. Cthulhu is said to lie dead but dreaming within it. This phrasing is often misunderstood. The entity is not asleep in a bed-like sense, nor sealed within a chamber. The city itself appears to function as a stabilizing structure, a vast architectural condition that permits Cthulhu's continued existence in a latent state. The temple is not built for Cthulhu's comfort, but because his presence distorts reality. Other great old ones complicate the picture further. Yog-Sothoth, described as the gate and the key, is associated with thresholds rather than locations. In the Dunwich Horror, no central temple houses Yog-Sothoth. Instead, ritual sites, stone circles, and hilltop configurations act as momentary alignments. Architecture becomes temporary scaffolding for interaction, not containment. This suggests a hierarchy of forces. Some require monumental stabilization, others only precise configuration. The temple, then, is a technology, a crude human word, but a useful one, for managing cosmic proximity. Dreamland's beings introduce an additional layer of ambiguity. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, temples appear in landscapes shaped by collective unconsciousness. These are not hallucinations. They persist across dreamers, implying a shared ontological substrate. Entities like Nyarlathotep traverse these spaces freely, acting as messenger, manipulator, or observer. Unlike other great old ones, Nyarlathotep appears to use temples deliberately. He understands their function. This difference matters. It suggests that some entities are native to these structures, while others merely exploit them. We must pause here to address a common misinterpretation. The great old ones are often treated as a pantheon. They are not. There is no consistent hierarchy, no shared purpose, no unified cosmology. The temples reflect this fragmentation. Some are colossal and permanent. Others are provisional and decaying. Some align with celestial events. Others respond to psychological states. The only constant is inhuman scale. Not moral scale, but operational scale. These beings do not rule. They interfere. Lovecraft reinforces this through narrative distance. We never observe these entities constructing their temples. We infer their involvement from aftermaths, ruins left behind, geometries that echo their described attributes, cultic behavior attempting imitation. In the Ia Shadow Out of Time, the great race of Yith occupies bodies across epochs, leaving architectural traces that confuse later archaeologists. The temple becomes a fossil of intent, not sacred space, but residue of function. This reveals something profound. Architecture may be the only surviving evidence of minds too alien to leave texts. Comparative mythology sharpens this insight. In Mesopotamian myth, gods descended into temples to receive offerings. In Lovecraft, entities rarely descend at all. They phase, intrude, or resonate. The temple does not invite them. It compensates for their incompatibility with local reality. This is not worship. It is adaptation. Human cultists misread this distinction, treating temples as shrines rather than interfaces. Their rituals fail because they misunderstand purpose. The building was never meant to summon. It was meant to withstand. In conclusion, the entities associated with Lovecraft's temples are not occupants, but catalysts. Their presence bends space, fractures time, and destabilizes cognition. The temples exist as mediating structures, attempts, often by non-human intelligences, to localize forces that otherwise exceed material coherence. This reframes the horror. The question is no longer what lives within these temples, but what reality must do to allow such beings to exist at all. In the next section, we turn to the human cost of this proximity. For when people encounter these structures, the consequences are rarely physical, they are cognitive, and they are permanent. Human encounters with Lovecraft's temples rarely end in death. This is an important point. The dominant consequence is not physical destruction, but psychological disintegration. Madness functions not as punishment, nor as supernatural curse, but as the predictable outcome of exposure to structures that exceed human cognitive capacity. In Lovecraft's cosmology, the mind is not fragile, it is finite. Temples expose that finitude with clinical efficiency. The pattern appears early. In the nameless city, the narrator enters an ancient ruin and experiences overwhelming dread long before encountering any explicit threat. He notes a sense of being watched by something infinitely old, despite the apparent emptiness of the space. The architecture itself generates this effect. Narrow corridors, immense vaulted chambers, and alien reliefs distort spatial intuition. Madness begins not at revelation, but at orientation failure. The mind attempts to reconcile incompatible sensory data and collapses under the strain. This reveals a key function of madness in Lovecraft's work. It operates as a diagnostic instrument. Those who go mad are not weak-minded. They are, in many cases, trained observers, scientists, scholars, explorers. Consider the Antarctic expedition in At the Mountains of Madness. The protagonists approach the ruins with rational tools: measurement, documentation, hypothesis. These methods function until they encounter scale without reference and history without anchor. When Danforth later suffers a breakdown, it follows a moment of partial comprehension. He understands enough to realize how much remains inaccessible. That realization fractures him. We must pause here. Madness, in Lovecraft, is not the loss of reason, but the exhaustion of it. Rational frameworks are applied beyond their valid range. When they fail, the psyche experiences something akin to ontological vertigo. This is why survivors often retreat into silence rather than incoherence. They know what they saw, but also know that language cannot safely contain it. The mind does not shatter explosively. It erodes. A recurring behavioral symptom supports this interpretation: compulsive documentation. Characters sketch ruins obsessively, take measurements they cannot interpret, or fixate on architectural details. In The Shadow Out of Time, Peaslee becomes consumed by memories of alien cities whose geometries he cannot fully recall. The temples imprint themselves neurologically. This is not possession, it is contamination. The human mind becomes a partial archive of structures it was never meant to host. Importantly, madness is unevenly distributed. Some individuals endure longer than others. Lovecraft suggests several mediating factors: prior exposure to abstraction, emotional detachment, and, paradoxically, skepticism. Those who approach the temples as curiosities often break faster than those who sense danger immediately. This inversion matters. Curiosity becomes liability. The desire to understand accelerates collapse. Knowledge is not empowering here. It is corrosive. Comparisons to earlier horror traditions clarify the distinction. In Gothic fiction, madness often follows moral transgression or emotional excess. In Lovecraft, it follows accuracy. Seeing too clearly is the risk. The temples do not tempt. They clarify. They reveal a reality in which human values are irrelevant. The mind responds as any overloaded system would, by failing. Not dramatically, but irreversibly. In closing, madness serves a precise narrative and philosophical function. It marks the boundary where human cognition ends. Temples do not drive people insane because they are evil. They do so because they are true in a way incompatible with human mental architecture. In the next section, we examine what happens when this incompatibility becomes intellectual rather than psychological. When forbidden knowledge is not merely glimpsed, but partially understood, the collapse spreads beyond the individual mind to the very structure of knowledge itself. The most persistent illusion in Lovecraft's fictional universe is that knowledge leads to clarity. His temples disprove this not by concealing information, but by offering it incompletely. What they reveal is not hidden truth. but the inadequacy of human knowing. Scholars enter these ruins seeking data, symbols, language, evidence that the unknown can be rendered comprehensible. What they encounter instead is a deeper kind of horror, knowledge that resists containment. In this context, epistemology itself, the theory of knowledge, becomes the true site of collapse. Consider The Shadow Out of Time, in which Professor Peaslee, after a psychic exchange with the Yithian race, recovers fragments of vast trans-temporal history. His mind retains partial access to architectural forms, library systems, and alien technologies. But his academic training fails him. He cannot systematize what he knows. The problem is not a lack of information, but a surplus of incompatible frameworks. What he learns cannot be expressed within human categories. His crisis is epistemic, not emotional. The temple, the great library of the Yith, is not incomprehensible. It is over-comprehensible. It exceeds the bandwidth of human reason. This, too, is echoed in At the Mountains of Madness. Dyer and Danforth piece together the rise and fall of the elder things. Through murals and glyphs within the temple city, they reconstruct a plausible historical arc. But the more complete the picture becomes, the more unbearable its implications. The earth, they discover, was seeded and shaped by non-human intelligence. The temple does not withhold knowledge. It supplies too much. And with it comes the realization that human civilization is an incidental outcome of forces that did not intend, or even register, our existence. We must pause here. This inversion matters. In traditional esoteric narratives, forbidden knowledge is dangerous because it is secret, restricted by priests, encrypted in texts, or guarded by taboos. In Lovecraft, the danger is structural. The knowledge is available, but our tools for assimilating it are insufficient. The failure is not in the subject, but in the observer. The scholar becomes the limit of his own investigation. This creates a recurring narrative pattern, the accumulation of evidence followed by interpretive breakdown. Artifacts are recovered, inscriptions transcribed, ruins mapped. But just as a coherent theory begins to form, the narrative halts, sometimes abruptly. In The Call of Cthulhu, Inspector Legrasse collects cultist testimony, finds a bas-relief, and uncovers converging accounts from around the globe. Yet the climax comes not with confirmation, but with a moment of crisis. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy. The problem is not access to the event, but access to its meaning. Rhetorically, this leads to a peculiar form of anti-closure. Lovecraft's stories simulate the structure of academic inquiry: observation, hypothesis, synthesis, only to abandon it at the edge of revelation. The temple becomes a site of methodological failure. Empirical tools falter, rationality spirals. Even narrative coherence begins to decay. Stories conclude in silence, institutional denial, or madness. What remains is not a conclusion, but a rupture. Philosophically, this can be situated within a broader critique of Enlightenment epistemology. Lovecraft inherits the legacy of figures like Descartes, Bacon, and Kant, who sought to structure the world through reason. His temples demonstrate that the world, at scale, resists that structuring. They are not inexplicable. They are extralinguistic. No combination of sensory input and conceptual schema will suffice. This reveals something profound. Not all truths can be translated into knowledge. In closing, Lovecraft's temples are not merely locations of horror. They are instruments of unknowing. They do not hide. They dismantle. Scholars who study them lose not because they are weak, but because they are methodologically unequipped. The collapse is epistemic, not mystical. In the next part of our inquiry, we follow these fragments as they echo across literature. For though Lovecraft refused to name his truths, others attempted to record them, and in doing so, left trails of text, each more incomplete than the last. The concept of the Forgotten Temple did not arrive fully formed in Lovecraft's work. It emerged gradually, scattered across early tales, its architecture coalescing as narrative pattern rather than singular motif. The earliest glimpses appear not in grand cosmic dramas, but in dreamlike stories where space and memory shift imperceptibly. These proto-temples are neither named nor fully described. They manifest as atmospheric anomalies, vast, silent, often buried, foreshadowing the more monumental iterations that would later anchor the mythos. One of the earliest examples occurs in The Nameless City, 1921, a story Lovecraft claimed was his first to embody the true style of his later work. Here, the unnamed narrator explores an ancient ruin in the Arabian desert, encountering non-human architecture described in terms of both grandeur and unease. The sand-strewn blocks of stone seem to hold a kind of unwholesome familiarity. The description implies recognition without recollection, a motif that recurs in later tales. The architecture is scaled for a species other than humanity, and its decorations suggest a worldview alien to anthropocentric concerns. The temple here is not introduced as sacred space, but as fossilized intent, its builders long vanished, its purpose unreadable. This unreadability forms the connective tissue between early temple motifs and the broader mythos. In Polaris, 1918, an even earlier tale, the narrator dreams of a marble city beneath the pole star. Though never named a temple, the city's crystalline spires and inhuman symmetry imply sacred or ceremonial function. It ends, as many of Lovecraft's tales do, with a destabilization of reality. Was the city a dream, or was the waking world the illusion? Here, the temple is reimagined as psychic geography, a place visited not by travel, but by sleep. Later works will merge this motif with physical architecture, suggesting that some temples exist simultaneously in multiple epistemic states. These thematic seeds grow more explicit in The Other Gods, 1921, and The Doom That Came to Sarnath, 1920, where temples or high places serve as forbidden zones of encounter. In The Other Gods, mountaintop observatories become ritual points of contact with unknowable deities. The story ends, characteristically, in annihilation. The gods of Earth are not the gods of the outer hells. The architecture, once a symbol of aspiration, becomes a trap. In Sarnath, the temple at Ib is destroyed after its inhabitants are massacred. Centuries later, a vengeance beyond human scale descends upon the city. These early works encode a key narrative function of temples, not as sites of origin, but as nodes of retribution. We must pause here to observe the structural pattern that emerges. The temples, and their architectural kin, are introduced indirectly. They are described only through the perceptions of compromised narrators, those dreaming, hallucinating, or recollecting with uncertainty. Their details remain unstable, but the emotional effect is consistent: disorientation, reverence, dread. The reader is asked not to see the temple, but to experience the failure of seeing. This rhetorical choice binds disparate stories together. Even when locations, names, or timelines shift, the effect remains the same. Intertextual connections become increasingly deliberate as Lovecraft matures. In The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, R'lyeh is described in terms nearly identical to those in the nameless city. Great cyclopean blocks, greenish stone, geometry abnormal. The linkage is not just aesthetic, it suggests a shared architectural lineage. Lovecraft's mythos functions not through plot continuity, but through architectural recurrence. Temples are recognized less by name than by form. Impossible angles, non-human scale, alien inscriptions. Across stories, they build a mythic infrastructure, silent monuments signaling a deeper, unnamed design. Later tales such as The Shadow over Innsmouth and The Whisperer in Darkness reinforce this network. In Innsmouth, the submerged temple to Dagon is never fully seen, but its influence defines the town's history and cult. In Whisperer, the alien My-Go installs strange stone circles in remote Vermont woods, suggesting again that temples can take modular, even mobile forms. The suggestion is not of cultural imitation, but of structural repetition. These beings do not build shrines in the human sense. They construct interfaces, persistent architectural forms that recur wherever certain forces brush against our world. In sum, the Forgotten Temple evolves in Lovecraft's fiction, not through isolated appearances, but through narrative echo. Its earliest forms are dreamlike, suggestive, and functionally ambiguous. Over time, they become increasingly entangled with non-human agency, psychic collapse, and epistemic instability. But their core function remains stable, to mark a point of contact between the known and the unknowable. In the next section, we turn to a major story in which this function is fully realized. A city temple whose discovery initiates not a journey into the past, but an encounter with a timeline humanity was never meant to understand. At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, represents the most sustained architectural meditation in Lovecraft's body of work. Here, the Forgotten Temple is no longer a fragment or rumor, but an entire city, vast, systematic, and terrifyingly legible. The Antarctic expedition does not stumble upon a ruin by chance. It uncovers a functioning historical record carved into stone. This shift matters. The horror arises not from obscurity, but from comprehension carried too far. The city discovered beyond the Antarctic mountains is repeatedly described in architectural terms that emphasize scale without symbolism. Dyer notes, endless, labyrinths of colossal stone blocks, arranged with an efficiency alien to human design. The buildings are not monumental in the human sense. They are infrastructural. Corridors, towers, and chambers repeat with mechanical regularity. This is not ceremonial architecture, it is systemic. The implication is immediate. This city was not built to inspire awe, but to operate over geological time. Central to the city are vast mural-lined halls that function as historical archives. These walls depict the rise of the Elder Things, their scientific mastery, their wars, and their eventual decline. The temple becomes a library. But this is not a gift to future discoverers. The murals were not intended for human readers. Dyer realizes this slowly, observing that the carvings are arranged for beings with radial symmetry and different perceptual priorities. The temple preserves knowledge, but not for us. The fact that we can partially read it is an accident. We must pause here. This is one of Lovecraft's most radical narrative moves. The protagonists successfully decode alien history. They learn too much. They reconstruct timelines spanning hundreds of millions of years. This knowledge does not empower them. It destabilizes them. As Dyer writes, it was a terrible thing to learn, that the Earth had known life and intelligence long before man ever appeared. The temple's function is complete at this moment. It does not need to harm them physically. Its architecture has already done its work. The city temple also introduces a crucial innovation: maintenance. Dyer notes signs of repair, adaptation, and repurposing. This is not a dead ruin. It is a space that has evolved. Even after the elder things decline, the city persists, modified by later occupants and forces. The temple is revealed as a palimpsest of non-human history. Each layer complicates the last. This undermines a common archaeological assumption, that ruins move cleanly from function to abandonment. Here, abandonment is temporary. Function resumes in altered form. The presence of the Shoggoths crystallizes this unease. These amorphous beings were created as laborers, later rebelling against their creators. Their traces appear throughout the city: destroyed walls, sealed corridors, warning signs carved in desperation. The temple becomes a site of internal catastrophe. It records not only triumph, but failure. Architecture preserves the consequences of overreaching intelligence. This is not a moral lesson, but a structural one. Systems collapse when complexity exceeds control. Narratively, Lovecraft uses the city to reframe exploration itself as a transgressive act. Dyer's account is explicitly written as a warning, urging future expeditions to avoid Antarctica entirely. Knowledge here is not cumulative. It is dangerous to transmit. The story ends not with destruction, but with suppression. The temple remains intact, buried beneath ice, waiting. The reader understands that discovery was premature, not triumphant. And at the Mountains of Madness, the Forgotten Temple achieves full expression. It is archive, infrastructure, and existential indictment. It does not demand belief. It supplies evidence. And that evidence is sufficient to shatter any remaining confidence in human historical primacy. In the next case study, we descend from frozen continents to rising seas, where another city temple waits, not buried by time, but merely paused, aligned to awaken when the geometry is right. Lovecraft's architectural horrors did not end with him. After his death in 1937, fellow writers and correspondents extended his mythos, sometimes preserving his thematic intentions, sometimes distorting them. Among the most influential of these was August Derleth, who reshaped the cosmic neutrality of Lovecraft's universe into a quasi-theological struggle. This shift had direct consequences for how temples were imagined. What Lovecraft presented as inhuman and indifferent, Derleth recast as moral and oppositional. Locations of spiritual warfare, not epistemic instability. Derleth's reinterpretation introduced a rigid cosmology of elder gods and great old ones, aligning them respectively with good and evil. In this framework, temples became battlegrounds or prisons, sites where dark entities were sealed away by benevolent forces. This fundamentally altered their narrative function. No longer expressions of incomprehensible reality, they became cautionary monuments. Keep out, for evil lies within. The architecture remained alien, but its purpose was now moralized. A temple to Cthulhu might still collapse the mind, but it did so within a framework of divine punishment and cosmic justice. Elements largely absent from Lovecraft's original vision. This theological overlay flattens the ambiguity that made Lovecraft's temples effective. In stories like The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, co-credited to Lovecraft, but largely authored by Derleth, temples and ruined churches conceal imprisoned beings waiting for release. The implication is clear. Knowledge is dangerous because it tempts. The seeker risks unleashing evil. Contrast this with at the mountains of madness, where knowledge is dangerous not because it tempts, but because it exceeds. The difference is not trivial. Derleth's horror punishes hubris. Lovecraft's horror punishes comprehension. Yet not all post-Lovecraftian writers followed this path. Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft's peer and occasional collaborator, maintained the alien neutrality of these structures. In his Hyperborean cycle, temples appear as ancient repositories of forgotten magic, often indifferent to their current human intruders. In the Seven Geeses, for example, the Temple of Atlach-Nacha exists not as a holy place, but as a spatial inevitability, a node in a vast underground system leading toward a spider god's domain. The protagonist is given no moral test, only a logistical one. His journey ends not in revelation, but in consumption. The temple serves not as a warning, but as a corridor into extinction. Later writers like Ramsey Campbell and T.E.D. Klein revived Lovecraft's original approach with renewed subtlety. Campbell's British settings, particularly in stories like Cold Print, reimagined temples as hidden urban residues, sealed basements, unreadable inscriptions, anonymous tenements that hum with suppressed geometry. The sacred has migrated into the banal. Klein's The Events at Poroth Farm and Black Man with a Horn suggest that the temple may no longer require architecture at all. That belief, when strong enough, is its own structure. These variations preserve the core dread, not that something evil is coming, but that something incomprehensible never left. We must pause here to consider how media evolution affected the temple motif. As Lovecraft's influence spread into visual culture, comics, games, film, the temptation to depict the temple in explicit terms grew stronger. Visual literalism undermines narrative ambiguity. A temple that is fully seen is already half explained. Nevertheless, some creators managed to preserve mystery. In Alan Moore's Providence, temples are both symbolic and functional, embedded within institutions, underground rituals, and historical architecture. The horror emerges not from what is shown, but from what viewers realize they cannot unsee. The evolution of the temple across these interpretations reflects a broader tension in cosmic horror between revelation and restraint. Lovecraft's genius lay in his commitment to unknowability. Later expansions often struggle with this, veering either into theological allegory or visual spectacle. Yet the best of them retain the original structure's intent. They recognize the temple not as a place of worship, but as a threshold. Not a house for gods, but a pressure point in the fabric of reality. In conclusion, the forgotten temples of Lovecraft's mythos have persisted through reinterpretation, mutation, and appropriation. They have been made holy, evil, banal, and psychological. Yet the core fear remains that beneath the structures we build, literal or cognitive, older architectures still pulse. And these do not care what we believe. In the next section, we follow these architectures beyond fiction, into the territory of cultural myth, conspiracy, and psychological residue. For when the temple leaves the text and enters belief, it no longer requires stone. It needs only attention. If At the Mountains of Madness is Lovecraft's most comprehensive depiction of a forgotten city temple, then The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, is its mythic counterpoint. A story in which the temple functions not as a historical record, but as an active mechanism. R'lyeh is not a ruin. It is a submerged, dormant structure awaiting alignment. Its purpose is not to remember the past, but to initiate an event. This shift from passive record to latent activation marks a crucial evolution in Lovecraft's treatment of architecture. The city of R'lyeh is introduced through fragments, sailor accounts, cult testimonies, recovered artifacts. It does not exist within the main narrative timeline for most of the story. Instead, it emerges suddenly, surfacing from the Pacific due to a seismic event. The transition is not symbolic, it is geometrical. When the stars are right, the city rises. This alignment is not metaphorical fate, but literal spatial condition. The temple becomes a temporal switch, structured to operate only when certain cosmic variables coincide. Its most famous architectural description comes from Gustav Johansen, the lone survivor of a ship that encounters the risen city. His account is terse, overwhelmed by the failure of description. The geometry of the place was all wrong. One could not be sure that the sea and the ground were horizontal. Everything was monstrous, vague, and wrong. The city defies Euclidean logic, collapsing distinctions between inside and outside, vertical and horizontal. Even before Cthulhu appears, the architecture destabilizes cognition. The temple's terror lies not in what it contains, but in how it disorders space. We must pause here. Unlike mountains, where understanding grows incrementally, Cthulhu presents a rupture. The narrator is not a direct witness, but an investigator, piecing together disparate clues, newspaper clippings, academic notes, personal testimonies. The city is experienced only by those who briefly survive its emergence. This layering of secondhand accounts creates a rhetorical fog. The temple is glimpsed through trauma, not study. Its form becomes an after-image stamped into the minds of the few who have seen it. None are unchanged. The city's most unsettling feature is not its geometry, but its agency. R'lyeh behaves like a structure with intent. It submerges, it rises, it recedes again. The implication is clear. The temple itself participates in the conditions of Cthulhu's dormancy. Its physical form is tied to his metaphysical state. It is not a tomb. It is a container, but not in the protective sense. The containment is not for us. It is structural, an equilibrium that delays awakening until certain cosmic conditions are met. The temple is both prison and promise. Cthulhu's emergence from the city is described not with triumphant resurrection, but with ontological disturbance. A mountain walked or stumbled. The god does not exit a chamber. He rises as part of the city itself. This suggests a deeper connection between entity and architecture. Cthulhu is not housed by R'lyeh. He is R'lyeh, or at least an extension of its spatial logic. The city's awakening is his own. This narrative fusion of being and building complicates traditional models of sacred space. The divine does not visit the temple. It is the temple. R'lyeh's resubmergence at the Exhiuba, story's end, is just as crucial. Its disappearance is not a defeat, but a deferral. Cthulhu is unharmed. The geometry has simply misaligned again. The temple returns to latency, inaccessible yet not gone. The final lines of the story leave the reader with a chilling reminder. That is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons, even death may die. The temple's temporality exceeds all human calendars. It is not ruined, it is waiting. In the call of Cthulhu, the temple shifts from inert structure to active cosmological participant. It signals, triggers, and withdraws. Its horror is architectural not because of what it holds, but because of how it holds, temporally, spatially, and psychologically. The story leaves us with a lingering unease, that somewhere beneath the waves, a city still pulses with misaligned angles, waiting for time itself to turn the key. In the next section, we explore how later authors inherited and sometimes misunderstood, this architecture of dread. The idea of the Forgotten Temple has never remained confined to fiction. Since Lovecraft's death, structures resembling his descriptions have surfaced, not in physical reality, but in modern mythology. These are not literary analyses or adaptations. They are hoaxes, urban legends, and conspiratorial whispers, photoshopped ruins in Antarctica, misinterpreted sonar scans of underwater anomalies, strange satellite blurs in deserts, all purported to be found. The storylines that emerge follow a consistent logic. There is something massive, ancient, and misaligned with known history, and someone is keeping it hidden. These are not just stories, they are symptoms. One of the most persistent examples is the so-called Antarctic Pyramid, a formation visible on Google Earth, coordinates first circulated in 2016. Purportedly resembling a step pyramid, the structure gained rapid attention across conspiracy forums and YouTube channels. Videos posited links to Atlantis, aliens, and of course, the Elder Things. Though the formation is a natural nunatak, a mountain peak exposed above glacial ice, the visual ambiguity was enough. The idea had already taken hold. The physical explanation, correct though it may be, arrived too late to prevent myth from forming. The temple had already emerged in the collective imagination. A similar pattern surrounds the Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan, an underwater rock formation with apparent terraces, pillars, and flat surfaces. Though most geologists agree it is natural, fringe theorists argue otherwise, drawing connections to ancient civilizations and forgotten cataclysms. The resemblance to Lovecraftian imagery, sunken stone, angular passages, non-human scale, is striking. Whether intentional or not, such structures become archetypes. The temple no longer needs narrative context. It only requires visual suggestion. A few misaligned stones, a shadowed crevice, and the story assembles itself. This reflects a broader cultural need to encounter something older than explanation. In an age saturated with data, algorithmic predictions, and mapped terrain, the possibility of discovering the unclassified becomes a kind of spiritual longing. The temple, as a motif, offers a paradoxical hope, not for answers, but for a disruption, a reminder that not everything is contained. This is why false discoveries persist. They feed a hunger that historical record cannot satisfy. Lovecraft's genius was in constructing ruins designed not to resolve that hunger, but to magnify it. We must pause here. It is tempting to dismiss these sightings as unserious, fantasies of the credulous or the bored, but their persistence suggests otherwise. In a media landscape shaped by uncertainty and institutional distrust, the idea that ancient truths are being concealed has become culturally ambient. The temple becomes the ideal metaphor: inaccessible, buried, misinterpreted. It stands for everything withheld. The archaeological hoax becomes political parable. What else are we not being told? This dynamic extends into digital folklore. Reddit threads speculate about hidden coordinates blacked out on satellite maps. TikTok videos claim to have captured structures in remote terrain. ARGs, alternate reality games, fabricate expeditions to lost cities, blending real historical references with Lovecraftian invention. The aesthetic is always the same: grainy images, distorted geometry, panicked narration. The content may be fake, but the structure of belief mirrors older religious pilgrimage, an interpretive journey towards something just out of reach. The temple, even digitally constructed, retains its power. In sum, the Forgotten Temple persists not just in story, but in belief systems. Its allure stems from what it promises and withholds: knowledge, disruption, and a confrontation with scale. Whether glimpsed in ice, stone, or pixels, it functions as an epistemic lure, a visual idea that cannot be unthought. In the next section, we examine how this structure has migrated into formal media, films, games, and music. There, too, it resists full representation, but continues to operate, not as a place of arrival, but as a point of psychic departure. The Forgotten Temple has proven remarkably resistant to adaptation. While many stories draw on Lovecraftian mythos, few succeed in conveying the precise architectural unease his temples evoke. Structures not built to impress or shelter, but to unsettle, to operate. Yet the motif recurs, reimagined, visualized, fragmented across film, games, and music. These media offer powerful tools of immersion, but often struggle with a core paradox. To depict the temple is to limit it. The more clearly it is shown, the more mystery is lost. Film adaptations, both direct and inspired, often use temples as sites of awakening. In John Carpenter's The Thing, 1982, though based on Campbell rather than Lovecraft, the Antarctic setting and the buried alien structure echo at the Mountains of Madness. The horror emerges not from what is seen, but from what architecture has preserved. The alien organism is discovered within a ruin that resists interpretation. Similarly, The Void, 2016, features a hospital transformed into a gateway temple by a cult attempting to transcend death. The architecture becomes fluid, hostile, and symbolic of unseen dimensions, a rare visual attempt to suggest metaphysical intent without over-definition. More successful still are works that withhold. In Alex Garland's Annihilation, 2018, the alien presence is centered in a lighthouse, a kind of inverted temple where biological and spatial laws collapse. Inside, geometry folds into itself, and characters lose the ability to map their surroundings. The scene avoids exposition. Instead, the audience experiences the epistemic failure directly. This aligns closely with Lovecraft's strategy. The structure destabilizes the self before it reveals anything about the other. We must pause here. Video games, unlike film, offer an interactive relationship to space. They can turn the temple from set piece into experience. Darkest Dungeon, Bloodborne, and Call of Cthulhu each incorporate non-Euclidean architecture, madness mechanics, and ancient ruins. In Bloodborne, the labyrinthine ruins beneath Yharnam are explicitly tied to entities that predate humanity. Exploration becomes existential descent. The geometry twists slowly. Stairs lead nowhere. Walls breathe. Altars shift. The temple is not a level. It is a process of unraveling. The player enacts the collapse that Lovecraftian protagonists merely report. Tabletop games also build on this idea. Call of Cthulhu, the role-playing game, 1981, emphasizes sanity loss during exploration. Temples in these campaigns are never fully mapped. Dungeons and Dragons modules inspired by the mythos, such as the Sunless Citadel, borrow aesthetic, elements, cyclopean stone, glyphs, ritual scars, but often reduce the unknowable to the monstrous. A temple that can be cleared misses the point. Yet in these spaces, the power of collaborative imagination sometimes restores ambiguity. The unknown returns, not through design, but through interpretation. Music offers a different approach, conveying the temple not visually, but emotionally. Dark ambient artists like Lustmord, Atrium Carcery, and Nox Arcana craft soundscapes that mimic the experience of navigating ancient, empty ruins. These are not songs, but acoustic architectures. Dripping echoes, distant chants, low-frequency drones, these auditory cues simulate scale, disorientation, and ritual absence. The temple is constructed in the mind's ear, not the eye. The listener does not see the horror. They move through it, uncertain where it begins or ends. This persistence across media suggests that the temple operates less as a fixed image and more as a modular structure, a set of atmospheric and thematic conditions. These include non-human scale, destabilized geometry, latent threat, and the sense that architecture itself is active. Successful adaptations preserve these conditions without over-defining them. They resist the impulse to explain. Instead, they recreate the emotional trajectory: curiosity, confusion, vertigo, collapse. In closing, we find that the Forgotten Temple remains a potent but unstable element in modern media. Its core function is not to be seen, but to disrupt seeing. Whether approached through pixels, sound waves, or camera lens, it demands restraint. To over-render is to weaken. Yet when creators allow the structure to breathe, when they hint rather than declare, the temple reveals its true purpose, not as scenery, but as a medium of cognitive transformation. In the next section, we examine how this transformation has taken root in subcultures and academic spaces, where the temple has become not only a site of horror, but a symbol of inquiry itself. While Lovecraft's temples originated as fictional devices, they have since evolved into conceptual tools, adopted, reinterpreted, and recontextualized by subcultures, artists, and even scholars. Detached from their original narratives, they now circulate as metaphors for cognitive thresholds, as symbols of epistemic instability, and as aesthetic markers of anti-humanist thought. In these spaces, the temple is not merely a relic of horror fiction. It becomes an invitation to think beyond the human scale and beyond the human frame. In online subcultures, especially those clustered around digital horror and speculative fiction forums, the temple motif functions as both trope and tool. Threads on sites like Reddit's ER liminal space or ERR backrooms often describe empty structures whose purpose is ambiguous, whose layout defies logic. Images of brutalist architecture, stark concrete forms, windowless monoliths, staircases that lead nowhere are frequently accompanied by captions evoking cosmic dread. These are not overt references to Lovecraft, but the influence is unmistakable. The temple becomes a shared visual grammar for alienation. Its presence signals that meaning, if it exists, lies elsewhere. Artists working in speculative sculpture and installation art have also seized upon the motif. Works by Daniel Arsham, for example, feature decaying monuments embedded with anachronistic objects, calcified electronics, eroded statuary. Though not explicitly Lovecraftian, they conjure the same affect, the uncanny persistence of a structure whose builders have vanished, whose purpose is misaligned with present-day logic. Similarly, Polish painter Zdzisław Beksinski's surreal landscapes, filled with crumbling towers and uninhabitable sanctuaries, mirror the emotional logic of the Forgotten Temple. These works tap into something primal, the discomfort of encountering a system that refuses explanation. We must pause, here to examine a more formal appropriation: academia. In recent years, scholars in architecture, media theory, and speculative realism have begun to explore Lovecraft's ideas not as pulp entertainment, but as philosophical provocations. The temple, in these discussions, becomes a metaphor for the limits of anthropocentric design. Mark Fisher, in his analysis of the weird and the eerie, identifies architecture as a key site where the uncanny emerges, not through overt horror, but through subtle violations of expectation. A temple that looks too perfect, too symmetrical, or too indifferent to human use becomes an object of metaphysical unease. In architectural theory, the term non-anthropocentric design has gained traction, referring to structures that do not prioritize human scale, comfort, or function. Some theorists have provocatively suggested that we imagine buildings for post-human occupants. The forgotten temple, whether submerged, buried, or dream-locked, becomes a conceptual anchor for this thought experiment. What would architecture look like if it were meant not to shelter us, but to endure without us? The question is not Lovecraftian in tone, but its implications echo his vision. Academic interest has also emerged in literary studies, where the temple becomes a case study in narratological instability. Scholars have noted how Lovecraft's use of fragmentary texts, corrupted translations, and unreliable narrators mirror postmodern anxieties about truth and representation. The temple, as an unreadable object, serves as both symbol and structure. It defies the reader's interpretive impulse, standing as a silent counter-argument to narrative coherence. Its role is not to be explained within the story, but to reveal the limits of explanation itself. Finally, there is the curious phenomenon of the temple as thought experiment. In online philosophy and theory circles, particularly those influenced by speculative realism and object-oriented ontology, the temple is deployed as a metaphor for unknowable systems. What does it mean to encounter an object whose purpose eludes not just our tools, but our categories? In this context, the temple becomes a symbol not of horror, but of humility. A reminder that human understanding is not the ceiling of reality, but a low floor in a far larger edifice. In closing, the Forgotten Temple has escaped its fictional origins. It now circulates as symbol, metaphor, aesthetic, and provocation. Whether haunting liminal internet spaces or anchoring speculative theory, it persists because it offers something rare, a structure that demands nothing from us, yet unsettles everything. In the final section, we turn inward. For the temple, ultimately, is not just a place in space or story, but a shape within thought. Its architecture remains even after we leave it. The Forgotten Temple is not merely a motif. It is a persistent idea, lodged within the cultural psyche, long after the page is turned or the screen fades to black. Something remains. The architecture does not vanish. It reconfigures itself within thought. Why does the image of a structure, vast, silent, older than memory, continue to trouble us? Why does the idea of an edifice without meaning haunt more than one, constructed with sinister intent? The answer lies in what the temple reveals about the human need for orientation, and the terror that arises when that need is denied. Lovecraft's temples do not oppose humanity, they ignore it. This is their most radical implication. The temple does not recognize the observer. It was not built to communicate, welcome, or judge. It was never meant to be seen, and yet it is seen. That misalignment between presence and perception, between what is there and what can be grasped, triggers a quiet collapse. This is not narrative horror. It is ontological discomfort. The realization that there are things in the world that are not for us, not even against us, but entirely orthogonal to our categories. Psychologically, the temple endures because it destabilizes more than belief. It questions structure. In dreams, in anxiety loops, in architectural nightmares, we return to this image: the endless hallway, the sealed chamber, the impossible stairs. These are not coincidences. They are expressions of a deeper anxiety, the fear that reality may not conform to sense. The temple becomes a mirror for the unconscious. not symbolic in a Freudian or Jungian sense, but structural. It offers no story, only the echo of spatial failure. Its corridors do not end. Its meaning does not resolve. This reveals something profound. The temple persists because it denies resolution. Traditional horror offers escape, cleansing, closure. Lovecraft's temples offer none of these. The protagonist may flee, but the idea has already taken root. It does not dissipate with distance. It is not a creature to be outrun. It is an understanding that cannot be unlearned. Once seen, half seen, it alters perception. The fear is no longer in the structure itself, but in the permanence of its implications. Philosophically, the temple embodies a crisis of scale. Human thought evolved to navigate environments of survival, not cosmic architecture. The temple exposes that gap. It introduces dimensions we cannot map, durations we cannot inhabit, logics we cannot mirror. It is not that the temple contains knowledge we lack. It is that it operates in a system where knowledge, as we define it, is irrelevant. To encounter the temple is to confront the possibility that our frameworks are parochial. And yet, the mind continues to seek orientation. This tension between seeking and failure is the essence of the unease. There is, in this way, an ethical dimension to the Forgotten Temple. It invites humility, not the moral humility of guilt, but the cognitive humility of scale. To stand before something vast and unreadable and not impose meaning upon it, that is a rare and difficult posture. Lovecraft's horror does not ask us to fear malevolence. It asks us to withdraw projection, to accept that the world may not be shaped for comprehension, and that comprehension itself may be a local phenomenon. In this sense, the temple is not a threat. It is a boundary marker. We must pause here. The enduring power of the temple is not its depiction, but its aftermath. It lingers in the mind because it interrupts. It does not fit into memory cleanly. It loops, reasserts, shadows thought. Readers, players, and viewers report recurring dreams, feelings of spatial anxiety, moments of recognition in certain buildings or landscapes. These are not symptoms of belief. They are residues of implication. The temple leaves a cognitive mark because it suggests something we cannot finish thinking about, something that does not end where our tools of explanation do. In closing, the temple remains, not because we continue to read Lovecraft, but because we continue to return to the limits of our own understanding. It stands for everything that resists framing, that exceeds context, that does not resolve. And perhaps it was never meant to be destroyed or understood. Perhaps its purpose was always this: to show us where comprehension ends, and to remain in that space forever, silent, intact, waiting